Sandman.
Greetings, friends. I'm sure some of you have heard the story of a creature called the Pigman. In some stories he is a mad maniac, in others a creepy creature with mysterious origins. In this video, I will tell my version of the legend of the Pigman, written by me. Make yourself comfortable and listen very carefully. The full moon cast an eerie glow over the farmhouse as John stared out into the darkness. He had lived on this secluded farm his entire life, but tonight something felt different. A heavy fog crept over the fields, and the usual nighttime sounds of crickets and owls were replaced by an unsettling silence. As John peered out the window, his eyes suddenly fixed on a strange shape emerging from the fog. It looked like a man, but its head was that of a pig. Blood dripped from its snarling snout, and its eyes glowed red with malice. The Pigman lurched towards the house, grunting and snorting with each shambling step. John's heart pounded in his chest. This had to be the monster from the stories, the legendary Pigman. He had grown up hearing tales of the pig-headed creature that stalked the woods at night, but had always dismissed them as rural folklore. Now the nightmare appeared to be real. John rushed to check that the doors were locked and then ran upstairs to warn his family. But as he sprinted down the hallway, he was stopped short by the sight of his daughter Emily standing motionless, staring vacantly out her bedroom window into the fog. "Emily!" John shouted. "We have to get out of here. There's something out there." But Emily remained still, entranced by the view outside. As John approached, he was horrified to see the glow of the pig's red eyes reflecting in Emily's own. The monster had her under some kind of trance. John grabbed Emily's shoulders and shook her violently, breaking the spell. She blinked in confusion, then screamed as her gaze fell upon the nightmarish creature emerging from the fog. The Pigman was now in the center of the yard, staring right at them with its unnatural eyes. It opened its mouth and let out an awful squeal that sounded almost gleeful. "Hide!" John yelled, pulling Emily away from the window. They ducked down in her closet just as the sounds of shattering glass rang out through the house. The monster was inside. Heavy footsteps thudded upstairs, accompanied by snorts and snarls. Terror gripped John, but he knew he had to protect his family. As the footsteps drew closer, John burst out of the closet with Emily behind him. He grabbed a nearby softball bat, ready to face the intruder. The Pigman was halfway down the hall, dragging its hooves along the wooden floor. It stopped and eyed John hungrily, drool oozing down its furry chin. With another terrible squeal, it rushed forward. John swung the bat with all his might as the Pigman charged. The wooden bat struck the creature's face with a loud crack, splitting its skin and sending a spray of blood across the walls. The monster stumbled back with an enraged howl, giving John and Emily just enough time to slip past it and run for the stairs. They raced down the steps two at a time, the heavy footfalls of the Pigman close behind. As they reached the bottom, John realized they were cornered. The front door hung from its hinges where the monster had smashed its way in. Their only escape route led straight back out into the fog-filled farmyard, and certain death. But they had no choice. Gripping Emily's hand, John made a run for it. The icy fog enveloped them as they left the house, obscuring everything more than 10 feet away. They ran blindly, hoping to make it to the nearby forest where they could hide. The farm was deathly silent apart from their panicked breaths. Then the Pigman let out a shriek from somewhere close behind them. Its cloven hooves stomped the ground as it zeroed in on their location. Emily's hand was torn from John's as the girl veered off to the left in terror. He tried to follow but was immediately disoriented by the impenetrable fog. John called out desperately to his daughter, but there was no reply. The pig's snarl sounded fainter now, evidently it had followed Emily rather than him. She was leading it away, sacrificing herself for his escape. Sick with guilt but seeing no other option, John turned and continued running into the woods. The trees enveloped him in darkness, branches whipping his face as he went deeper into the forest. Gradually he became aware of a distant squealing cry echoing through the woods. The Pigman had caught Emily. Fighting back tears of anguish, John collapsed to the forest floor. He sat there, listening helplessly to the sounds of his sweet daughter's demise. As the pigman's cries faded away, John was left alone in the dark forest. Despite his grief over Emily's horrific death, he knew he had to pull himself together and keep moving. The creature could come back for him at any moment. John stood, stumbling on weak legs out of the woods toward an old dirt road that ran along the forest's edge. No lights shone in the distance, only more sinister fog. But John had no choice but to follow the road and hope it led to help. His home was lost to the monster now. Shivering against the cold night air, John walked on. The trees loomed like silent watchers, their gnarled branches reaching toward him as if begging him to stay in the forest's hungry grasp. Some small nocturnal creature rustled in the underbrush nearby, making John flinch in terror. He imagined the red eyes of the pigman at every turn. Just as John felt ready to collapse from exhaustion, he spotted the faint glow of a street lamp ahead. The road was leading into the neighboring town. Ignoring his aching legs, John jogged down the road toward suburban houses. But as the neighborhood took shape around him, he sensed something was wrong. There were no lights in any windows. No cars on the driveways. An unnatural silence hung over the entire street. Apprehension rising, John approached one of the identical single-story homes. He knocked loudly but there was no answer. The front door was unlocked, so he pushed it open and peered inside. "Hello? Please help me." His plea was met with silence. Stepping reluctantly from the doorway, John continued down the empty street. It seemed the entire town was either abandoned or, perhaps, hiding from the same evil that had invaded John's farm. There was nowhere left to turn now. No one to help him. He really was alone. Just then a chorus of terrified screams pierced the stillness from a few streets away. John felt a spark of hope. He ran toward the sound, barely processing the danger. As he turned a corner onto a new street, he skidded to a halt at the nightmarish sight before him. Every person on the street, men, women, even children, stood frozen in place, just like Emily had. Their blank eyes glowed red as they stared reverently toward a dark figure at the end of the road. The pigman. John's mind reeled in horror. The entire neighborhood was under some kind of hypnotic trance induced by the pigman. John ducked behind a parked car before the monster noticed him. Peering around the bumper, he watched the pigman gesture silently with a hoof, and the entranced people began to march stiffly towards it. Their eyes remained glassy and red as they moved in unison like zombies. John realized then that no one here could help him. They were all under the monster's control. Springing up from behind the car, John backed away down a side street to escape before he was seen. He had to get out of town. But just as hope flickered again, a chilling squeal rang out behind him. The pigman had noticed him after all. John sprinted, his muscles burning, as the thunderous footfalls of the creature pursued him. The side street ended abruptly at a tall, chain-link fence. He was cornered again. John wheeled around to face the oncoming monster. It towered over him, red eyes ablaze with sadistic excitement as it closed in for the kill. With no options left, John shoved a trash can at the creature to momentarily slow its advance. He used this chance to scramble up the fence. The metal wire clawed at his hands and the pigman's gnarled fingers grazed his ankles as he climbed. But desperation pushed John over the top. He threw himself over and dropped to the ground on the other side. Without looking back, John took off running again. He had to escape this town and its inhuman inhabitants. Up ahead, rising over the rooftops, he spotted a steeple. A church. Surely consecrated ground would provide refuge from the foul beast. He just had to reach it. With the sounds of the pigman's fury driving him on, John pushed through his exhaustion toward the church. He burst through the front doors, slamming them closed behind him. The cavernous interior was empty, only flickering candle light illuminating the pews. John collapsed in front of the altar, praying feverishly for deliverance. But the sturdy oak doors burst open behind him. The pigman stood in the doorway, parts of the broken fence still stuck to its body. John cried out in despair. Nowhere was safe from the monster. It was toying with him now, trapping him here in this unholy church to die. John clenched his eyes shut, not wanting to see the final strike. But it did not come. Cautiously, John opened his eyes and looked around. He gasped to see the pigman writhing in the aisle as if in pain. It was the consecrated ground, it was working. The monster could not approach further. John was protected. Overwhelmed with relief, John lay down on a pew. He had survived the night against all odds. The morning sun would drive the creature back to its lair and John would finally be free of its evil. For now, he rested. The church would be his haven until dawn. John was jolted awake by the deafening sound of splintering wood. He sat up with a start to see the pigman smashing the church doors to pieces with its bare hooves. Dawn had arrived, sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, yet the monster remained unfazed. It had found a way in. John stumbled back down the aisle as the creature stomped towards him, oozing black blood from the blisters the consecrated ground had burned into its flesh. John pleaded to God that the rising sun would stop the demonic beast, but it only kept coming, slower now but with renewed bloodlust in its eyes. With nowhere left to run, John collapsed to his knees and closed his eyes for the inevitable. But instead of death, an eerie silence followed. He cracked one eye open. The pigman had stopped its advance, head cocked in curiosity at something behind John. Turning to look, John gasped to see Emily emerge from the shadows of the altar, very much alive. But she seemed changed. Her eyes were now the same glowing red as the pig's and she regarded John coldly, as a stranger. When she spoke, her voice echoed as if two were speaking through her. "Come with me, Piggy," she beckoned to the monster. "We must go below to regenerate and gather our strength." To John's horror, Emily lifted a trapdoor in the altar floor which led to a secret basement he never knew existed under the old church. Without hesitation she climbed down into the darkness, the pigman following obediently. John wanted to call out to the daughter he loved, but he knew the innocent girl he had known was gone, consumed by something ancient and evil. The trapdoor slammed shut, leaving John alone again. But he knew the quiet could not last. The two creatures were resting, regenerating, preparing. When night fell again, the true horror would begin. John had to stop them before that happened. He had to go into that basement and end this. Gripping a heavy iron candelabra as a weapon, John steeled himself. He descended the ladder into the darkness below. The musty basement air choked John's lungs as he felt his way blindly forward. The space was pitch black, he could see nothing, only hear his own shallow breaths. Fear gripped him but he had to keep going. John crept through the shadows, candelabra raised. He turned a corner and recoiled as his light fell upon a row of glass tubes. Inside each floated a deformed monstrosity, twisted mutations of man and pig. So this was the source of the creatures. Continuing on, John sensed the space open up around him. He was in a large, circular room. His light glinted off shards of glass littering the floor, remains of more tubes. Steps echoed from the darkness on all sides. They were in here with him. John's blood turned to ice as squeals erupted from the blackness. Cloven hooves stampeded toward him. With nowhere to run, John closed his eyes and accepted his fate. But the expected impact never came. Instead, a rush of air and startled squeals filled the room. John opened his eyes to see the pigman and Emily cowering from him. Somehow, the light he carried was keeping them at bay. Emboldened, John thrust the makeshift torch toward the creatures. They retreated further from its glow. His fear diminished, John could think clearly again. These things, whatever they were not invincible demons, but flesh and blood creatures. The glass tubes proved that they could be created and destroyed, and they could not stand the light. Raising the candelabra high, John advanced on the cowering abominations. Their screams intensified as the light's purifying fire burned their tainted flesh. John drove them back, step by step, until the creatures were pressed against a cold stone wall. Their unholy shrieks reached a fever pitch. There was nowhere left for them to run. With a roar, John hurled the candelabra and its holy flames at the wall, igniting a tapestry hung there. The fire quickly engulfed the ancient fabric and leapt hungrily to the ceiling. Emily let out an unearthly wail as the blaze trapped them against the wall. Soon, their unholy screams faded. John turned and climbed back up the ladder to the church, finally free. The building was old and wooden, it would be an inferno within minutes. He stumbled outside and watched as flames consumed the structure, destroying any evil remnants within. The rising sun banished the lingering fog and shadows. John took a deep breath, overwhelmed with relief. It was over at last. The creatures were dead. The long nightmare was finally gone with the light of dawn. In the weeks that followed, John worked tirelessly to restore his family's farmhouse. It gave him some comfort to have a task to keep his mind occupied, though Emily's absence still haunted him. He prayed she was at peace now. John knew he would carry the trauma of that night for the rest of his days. By day, he toiled around the farm under the healing light of the sun. But at night, old fears crept back in. Lying alone in the dark, John would hear creaks and settle noises of the old house and imagine the Pigman's hooves stomping up the stairs. He longed for morning when the terrors of the night would be banished. To further ease his mind and feel safer in the vulnerable night hours, John adopted a watchdog, a massive mastiff named Thor. The intelligent beast guarded the house faithfully, never leaving John's side. With Thor on patrol, John finally slept through the night. In the months that followed, the worries plaguing John's mind gradually diminished and life carried on as normal. Work on the farm and Thor's reliable company returned a sense of peace to John's world. He was able to remember Emily with joy instead of pain. The horrors of that night became faded memories that lost their sharp edges over time. Then late one night, as John lay drifting off to sleep, Thor let out a vicious snarl. His eyes glowed red in the darkness. John awoke with a scream as the walls of his bedroom began to twist and melt around him, shifting into nightmarish shapes. Thor's head stretched and morphed into a hideous pig snout before John's eyes. Reality warped into a swirling kaleidoscope of madness. John cried out for mercy. But there was none to be found. There was only the gleeful squeal of Piggy claiming his mind at last. The imaginary threat was gone, but the danger had been real all along. It lived in John's fragile psyche, warped by tragedy. And now, after all these months, it had returned to plague his mind. This time, John would never find the light of dawn. His final nightmare had just begun.